My name is Olivia. I want to take you back to the night when everything I thought I knew about my marriage cracked wide open. It started with a single sentence, one that I rehearsed in my head a dozen times, one I thought would reveal the truth about the man lying beside me each night. I got fired. That was all I said. Just 3 words. I expected shock, maybe worry, maybe even arms reaching to pull me close. What I got instead was rage. Brian slammed his laptop shut so hard the sound echoed across the living room. His face twisted with anger, not concern. "Of course you got fired," he snapped. "You've always acted like you know better than everyone. Maybe now you'll finally learn." The words hit me like bricks. For a moment I couldn't move. I stood frozen in the doorway, still in my work clothes, clutching the straps of my purse like they were the only thing keeping me from collapsing. I had imagined this scene so differently, me, in tears, him whispering that everything would be all right, that we would figure it out together. But what stood before me wasn't the man I married. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that it was all a test. I wasn't fired. I had been promoted. After years of hard work done quietly in the shadows, I had finally been recognized. My paycheck was about to rise higher than his, and deep down, I suspected that was the very thing he would never forgive. As I listened to his rage, something inside me shifted. For years, I had bent myself into smaller shapes to fit the mold he wanted, smiling when I wanted to scream, forgiving when I should have questioned, trusting when I should have looked closer. But tonight, in the face of his fury, I saw the cracks in our marriage clearer than ever before. They were jagged, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. I said nothing, not because I didn't have words, but because my throat closed tight, my body instinctively telling me to stay silent. It was as if silence might keep me safe long enough to see the truth unfold. And maybe it was fate, because if I had blurted out my promotion, if I had told him I was earning more than ever before, I would have missed what came next. I would have missed the darker truth waiting just beneath his anger. The living room felt colder than it had minutes before. He paced across the carpet, muttering about bills, about responsibility, about how I had never contributed anything of value. Each word carved deeper into me. It wasn't the money he cared about. It was power. It was control. That night when he finally stormed out to sleep on the couch, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling something unfamiliar rise in my chest. It wasn't only fear, though. Fear was there. It was resolve. My test had worked. It showed me who Brian truly was. Not a partner. Not an ally. But a man who would see my success as a threat. Looking back, I realized this was the first moment I began to reclaim myself. I didn't know yet about the secrets he was hiding, the betrayals waiting to surface. I didn't know about the plan he and his mother were weaving to erase me from my own home. All I knew was that my marriage wasn't built on love anymore. It was built on control, and that foundation was already crumbling. I pressed my palms against the sheets and made myself a silent promise. I would watch. I would listen. And when the time came, I would not let him break me. He thought my lie was weakness, but in truth, it was the spark that lit the fire of my resistance. This was no longer just about marriage. This was about survival. The morning after that fight, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the steam curling from my coffee. The man across from me wasn't the one I thought I had married. Brian scrolled through his phone, his face calm, almost indifferent, as if the night before had never happened. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't even look at me. I used to believe marriage was about being a team facing storms side by side. I had pictured a husband who would see me as his equal, who would cheer when I succeeded and comfort me when I stumbled. But in that moment, all those illusions shattered. Instead of a partner, I saw a stranger who seemed more worried about his pride than my well-being. His childhood echoed in my mind. His mother's voice was always there, drilling in the idea that the man should be the provider, the builder, the foundation. I had heard her say it so often that it felt like wallpaper in our house. Brian absorbed that mantra like it was law. And when I told him I lost my job, Even though it was a lie, he reacted not as a husband, but as someone defending a fragile identity that couldn't bear the thought of me outshining him. What he didn't realize was that I had already outshined him. My promotion meant more income, more recognition, more independence. Instead of celebrating, he would have seen it as betrayal. That's why I lied. I needed to know what kind of man I was living with. His reaction was worse than I imagined. The way he slammed the laptop shut the words he threw at me like daggers. The disgust in his eyes, it was like he had been waiting for a chance to unleash it all. I felt myself shrink in that kitchen chair, but at the same time, I felt something else rising, a small flame of clarity. That morning I didn't argue. I didn't reveal the truth. I let him believe his version of events because I needed to see more. Sometimes silence is the sharpest tool we have. And as I sat there, I realized the silence was also giving me power. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to him. I was observing him. When he left for work without saying goodbye, I remained seated at the table, my hands wrapped around the coffee mug like it was an anchor. My mind replayed the night before in loops, his fury, his words, the absence of love in his eyes. I had tested him with a simple sentence, and the results revealed the truth. He didn't see me as a partner. He saw me as a liability. That revelation was painful, but it was also freeing. It meant I no longer had to cling to the fantasy of us. I could start looking at him for who he really was, not who I wanted him to be. I picked up my phone and almost called my sister, but stopped. Not yet. This was my battle to face first. I had to collect proof, not just of what he was doing, but of who he had become. Sitting there, I whispered to myself a vow I would not be erased. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let anyone rewrite my story. If Brian wanted a war over control, he would find I wasn't as powerless as he thought. Before I go further, let me pause and ask you something. Stories like this often make people reflect on their own lives. Where are you watching from? Share it in the comments. I would love to know who is listening. And if you want to hear more real stories like mine, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The coffee turned cold, but my determination didn't. By the time Brian returned home that night smiling like nothing had happened, I had already decided. I wouldn't confront him yet. I would watch. I would wait. And when the truth came out, I would be ready. Because the truth always comes out, and when it did, it would change everything. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a house full of shadows. I began noticing things I had ignored before, tiny details that whispered a story I didn't want to believe. Brian started coming home later, and later always with vague excuses about meetings running long or traffic being worse than usual. At first I tried to accept it. People get busy. Deadlines pile up. But the excuses came too often, and his tone carried no warmth. The phone that once lay casually on the kitchen counter was now always face down, locked tight. If it buzzed, he would snatch it up before I could even glance at the screen. When I asked simple questions about his day, his answers were clipped, almost rehearsed, like he was checking boxes instead of talking to his wife. We had traditions, small ones, that meant the world to me. Saturday breakfasts at our favorite diner, evening walks through the park after dinner. Those were our rituals, anchors in our marriage. But suddenly those anchors were cut loose. Maybe next time, he would say with a shrug, his eyes never meeting mine. Week after week, next time never came. I told myself it was stress. His construction firm had just taken on a massive downtown project, and the pressure was higher than ever. That explanation soothed me for a while, but late at night when the house was silent, my gut whispered a different story. Something darker was happening, something that had nothing to do with blueprints or contracts. I remembered one night in particular, lying awake in our bed, staring at the faint glow of the digital clock. The sheets felt cold beside me. He hadn't come home yet, and it was nearly 2 a.m. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. When I finally heard the garage door open, I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. He slid into bed without a word, his body rigid, his back turned to me. I kept my breathing steady, but my heart pounded against my ribs like it wanted to break free. There was another memory I couldn't shake. 2 months before I tested him with the lie about losing my job, I had left work early. My team had wrapped a product launch ahead of schedule, and I thought it would be sweet to surprise him. I planned to cook his favorite dinner, open a bottle of wine, remind us both of the love we used to share. But when I opened the front door, the sound of his voice stopped me cold. He was on the phone, speaking in a tone I had never heard before, serious, clipped, almost calculated. "No, she doesn't suspect anything yet," he said. "We just need a little more time." Then came a laugh, but it wasn't his usual laugh. This one was sharp, cold, detached. I stood frozen in the hallway, gripping the doorframe as if it could keep me standing. I didn't hear the other person's voice. Maybe it wasn't on speaker, maybe it was. But every fiber of my being told me he was talking about me. Seconds later, he walked out of the bedroom, saw me, and smiled as if nothing had happened. He kissed me on the cheek, casual and warm, like he hadn't just admitted to plotting something in secret. I smiled back, pretending not to notice, and walked to the kitchen to boil pasta. But something in me cracked that evening. It was invisible, but it spread fast like glass fracturing beneath the surface. From that day forward, I began watching him differently. I noticed the way his stories didn't line up, the impatience in his tone when I asked about his day, the lies so small he didn't even realize I caught them. I realized I wasn't paranoid. My instincts weren't betraying me. They were screaming at me to wake up. It felt like grieving a slow death. The man I thought I married was slipping away, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew. Something was rotting at the core of our marriage, and if I didn't uncover it soon, it would consume me. That quiet fracture inside me was turning into resolve. I promised myself I would keep gathering the pieces, keep listening, keep watching, because the truth was circling closer, and once it revealed itself, there would be no going back. The moment that branded itself into my memory happened on an ordinary Friday. My office had finished a project earlier than expected, and I thought it would be a sweet gesture to come home early. I imagined lighting candles, cooking Brian's favorite pasta, opening a bottle of red wine. For years, those small rituals had brought us back together whenever life pulled us apart. I wanted to believe they still could. I unlocked the door quietly, already smiling at the thought of surprising him. But as soon as I stepped inside, I froze. His voice echoed down the hallway. It wasn't the relaxed, playful tone I knew. It was sharp-clipped, almost mechanical. I inched forward, pressing my back against the wall. "No, she doesn't suspect anything yet," he said. His words were calm, deliberate, like lines from a script he had practiced. My chest tightened. A long pause followed, then his voice again. "We just need a little more time." And then came the sound that hollowed me out, his laugh. But it wasn't the warm laugh I had fallen in love with. This laugh was cold, detached, even cruel. I gripped the doorframe until my knuckles ached. He was talking about me. I could feel it in every nerve of my body. I wanted to burst into the room, demand answers, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though my body knew this was not the moment to reveal myself. This was the moment to listen. A few seconds later, Brian stepped into the hallway. He spotted me instantly, and just like that, his face softened into a smile. He kissed my cheek casually, like nothing had happened. "You're home early," he said, his tone cheerful. I forced my lips to curl upward, though inside my chest felt like it was splintering. "Yeah," I replied softly, walking toward the kitchen. I busied myself with boiling pasta, chopping vegetables, performing the motions of a loving wife. But in my heart, something had cracked wide open. That night we ate dinner like everything was normal. He asked about my day, and I told him about the launch at work. He nodded, smiled at the right moments, laughed when I teased him about the overcooked garlic bread. But underneath it all, I couldn't stop replaying his words. "She doesn't suspect anything yet." From that evening on, I became a different version of myself. I watched him more carefully. I listened more closely. I tracked the subtle shifts in his behavior, the way he avoided eye contact, the impatience when I asked harmless questions, the vague excuses that unraveled under scrutiny. The worst part was the duality. In public, he still held my hand, kissed me on the forehead, played the role of a devoted husband. But behind closed doors, I could feel the distance growing. Every touch felt rehearsed. Every smile felt calculated. I told myself I wasn't crazy. I reminded myself that intuition is rarely wrong. And mine was screaming. I knew I had to stay quiet, keep collecting the signs because something much bigger was happening beneath the surface. Something that would soon come crashing into the light. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling in the dark. His breathing was steady, peaceful, as if he hadn't just been plotting something behind my back. I kept my own breathing slow, pretending to sleep, but my mind was racing. I thought about the vows we had spoken over a decade ago, the promises to stand together through better or worse. Were those just words to him, a costume he wore until something better came along? Or had I been blind, ignoring the signs all along? My heart whispered a truth I didn't want to accept. The man lying beside me was no longer my partner. He was a stranger in familiar skin, and whatever secret he was hiding, it was only a matter of time before it consumed everything we had built. That night marked a turning point. The quiet fracture inside me spread wider. I wasn't just suspicious anymore, I was preparing. I didn't know what exactly he was planning, but I knew I had to be ready. Because once the truth came out, it would change my life forever. After that night, every moment with Brian felt like a performance. His smile was too polished, his gestures too rehearsed, and his words too measured. I stopped taking them at face value. Instead, I let silence become my weapon. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse him. I simply watched. And the more I watched, the clearer the truth became. The little things grew impossible to ignore. He used to meet my eyes when we talked. Now he looked past me as if I were barely in the room. When I asked how his project downtown was going, he brushed me off with a vague fine. If I pressed further, his patience snapped like brittle glass. He would raise his voice, accuse me of nagging, and retreat behind his laptop or his phone. The phone itself was a fortress. He kept it on him at all times, face down, password protected, with a code I didn't know. Calls that once rang freely now went silent with a single swipe. Messages lit up the screen, but he shielded it with his hand, his shoulders tensing like a child, caught with a forbidden secret. On Saturdays, I would set the table for two, hoping he might remember our breakfasts at the diner, the ones that once felt sacred. But he would roll over in bed and mutter, "Maybe next time." There was no next time. That tradition died quietly, another casualty of whatever he was hiding. I told myself stories to cope. Maybe he was under pressure at work. Maybe the project was more demanding than he let on. Maybe he was just tired. But deep down, I knew those were lies. My gut twisted with a certainty I couldn't shake. Something was unraveling. And if I didn't acknowledge it, I would drown in denial. One evening I stood at the sink rinsing dishes when I caught my reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me looked tired, worn, but also sharper. I realized I had been carrying this suspicion like a secret illness, pretending everything was fine while my insides screamed otherwise. I whispered to my reflection, "You are not crazy. You are not imagining this." That whisper became my anchor. It gave me the courage to lean into the silence, to listen more carefully, to piece together the puzzle he thought he had hidden. Each late arrival, each locked phone, each impatient sigh became evidence. And though the evidence was circumstantial, it was enough to build a case in my heart. I remember lying in bed one night, Brian beside me scrolling on his phone. The blue glow lit his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. I rolled over pretending to sleep, but inside I was taking notes. He thought I was blind, but my eyes were open wider than ever. There's a strange kind of grief in moments like this. It's like mourning someone who is still alive. I grieved the man I thought I had married, the laughter we used to share, the safety I used to feel. Those things were gone, replaced by shadows and suspicion. But grief slowly hardened into something else resolve. I decided that I would no longer wait for him to confess, or for the truth to drop into my lap. I would collect the signs, guard my instincts, and when the moment came, I would be ready. Because survival doesn't come from denial, it comes from preparation. Let me pause here and ask you something. If you were in my shoes, seeing the late nights, the lies, the coldness, would you confront him immediately, or would you wait and gather proof? Tell me in the comments. I really want to hear how you would handle it. As I turned off the kitchen light that night, I felt the weight of my decision settle in. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't trapped. I was preparing for a fight I hadn't asked for, but one I would win. The silence in our home grew louder, heavier, but I carried it like armor. And deep inside, I knew the storm was coming. The only question was when. It was a weekday afternoon when the storm finally cracked open. I had stayed home from work pretending to feel unwell. The truth was, I needed time to think, to breathe, without Brian's presence pressing down on me. The house was still sunlight pooling across the hardwood floors when I heard the front door open. My stomach tightened. I wasn't expecting him. Then I heard another voice, higher, sharper, familiar. It was Linda, his mother. I froze in the hallway, pressing myself against the wall near the guest room. They spoke casually, as if they owned the house, as if their words couldn't carve my life to pieces. "Why the sudden midday visit?" Linda asked. "Everything's going exactly as planned," Brian replied, his tone almost pleased. My heart stopped. Planned? "She told me she got fired yesterday," he continued, totally devastated, just like you predicted. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. "Finally," Linda said with a sigh of satisfaction. "She won't have any choice now. She'll have to agree to our terms." My knees wobbled. I leaned against the wall, every nerve screaming. What terms? What were they planning? "She's completely dependent on me now," Brian said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Selling the house is just a matter of time." Linda chuckled, smug and cruel. "See, I told you that girl was never right for you. Too ambitious, too independent. You really think she'd be with you if it weren't for your father's house?" Her words punched through me. That house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was my home. 10 years of my life poured into its rooms, my money, my time, my heart. And here they were, plotting to rip it out from under me as if I were nothing but a tenant overstaying her welcome. "Don't start, Mom," Brian sighed. "We already talked about this." Then Linda asked a question that iced my blood. "And what about Claire? When are you going to tell her it's time?" Claire. The name cut through me like a blade. I knew who she was, Mark's girlfriend before the accident. Mark, Brian's older brother, gone in a car crash 3 years ago. Claire had vanished after the funeral. I never imagined she was still in Brian's orbit. "She's ready," Brian said, his voice softening. "The baby's doing great. Claire says he's growing fast. Already looks just like Mark." My stomach lurched violently. "I'll adopt him as soon as the divorce goes through." Brian continued, matter of fact, like he was discussing a business deal. "He'll be my son, our son." Linda purred with approval. "Just think how happy Claire will be when she hears the house is going up for sale. She's waited so long for this." The room spun around me, my chest constricted. This wasn't just betrayal, this was replacement. They weren't simply planning to leave me. They were plotting to erase me, to wipe me from the picture, and build their perfect little family with Claire and a baby who wasn't even Brian's. I bit down on my knuckle to stop myself from making a sound. My entire body trembled, but I couldn't tear myself away. I needed to hear it all. "Let's not get carried away," Brian muttered. "We still have to make sure Rachel doesn't fight us on the divorce." "She won't," Linda said with icy certainty. "Not if you handle it right. Remind her she has nowhere to go. No job, no savings. She'll fold." They thought I was powerless. They thought I was trapped. But I wasn't. Not yet. Not ever. I crouched there in silence until Linda's footsteps retreated and the front door closed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind was burning. My lie about losing my job had lured out the truth. They believed I was weak, but in reality, their plan was already falling apart. 'Cause I wasn't fired. I had been promoted. And I was done playing the victim in their script. I sat there long after the door shut behind Linda, my body pressed against the cool wall, my knees pulled tight to my chest. My pulse thundered in my ears, but my mind was sharper than ever. I had heard enough to know that this wasn't just betrayal. This was a conspiracy, one that reached beyond Brian's deceit and straight into his mother's poisoned heart. her words replayed again and again, too ambitious, too independent. To her, I wasn't a wife. I wasn't even a woman with a name. I was an obstacle, a burden standing in the way of the life she wanted her son to have. And then came the knife that twisted deepest Claire. I remembered her from Mark's funeral, a fragile young woman, quiet, barely able to speak through her grief. I had pitied her, then thought she had disappeared to rebuild her life somewhere far away. But the truth was far darker. She hadn't vanished. She had been waiting, and Brian had been waiting with her. The revelation hit me like ice water. They weren't just planning to replace me, they were resurrecting a ghost of the past, trying to stitch together a life that should have been Mark's. A house that had been my home for over a decade. A baby who wasn't even Brian's. And me erased like I never existed. I rose slowly from the floor, my legs trembling, but my resolve hardening. Every lie, every late night, every phone hidden away, it all made sense now. He hadn't been distant because of work. He had been building a future with someone else while pretending to share one with me. That evening, Brian acted like nothing had happened. He poured himself a drink, settled on the couch, and flipped on a game. His jaw was calm, his movements relaxed. If I hadn't been there in the hallway hours earlier, I might have believed his performance. But now every smile, every casual gesture felt grotesque. I said little, choosing instead to observe. He thought he was the director of this play, scripting every scene, rehearsing every word. But he underestimated me. He didn't realize I had begun watching more carefully than ever. As I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling while he slept beside me, I felt something shift deep inside. Fear was still there, yes, but it was joined by something stronger, determination. He thought he had broken me, but in reality, he had awakened me. The next morning I left before sunrise. Not for work, not yet. I needed proof. I needed to build my case quietly, brick by brick. I pulled out receipts, invoices, bank statements, every piece of evidence that showed my hand in building the life he now wanted to erase. And let me pause here to ask you something. If you discovered that your partner and their family were plotting to replace you, what would you do first? Would you confront them immediately, or would you stay silent and gather evidence? Share your thoughts in the comments. I really want to know how you would handle it. When I returned home, Brian greeted me with the same careful expression, a mix of indifference and counterfeit affection. He kissed my cheek, asked about my day, and smiled as though he hadn't spent the previous afternoon plotting my erasure. But as I looked into his eyes, I no longer saw the man I once loved. I saw a stranger who thought he held all the cards. What he didn't know was that I was already rewriting the script. This wasn't just about marriage anymore. It wasn't even about love. It was about survival, justice, and reclaiming the life he thought he could steal from me. And in that moment, I knew the war had already begun. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. It felt like I was living in a house built of glass, every wall transparent, every shadow distorted. I knew Brian's secret. I knew about Claire. And I knew about the baby who carried Mark's eyes, Mark's smile, Mark's blood. But Brian spoke about it as though he could simply slip into his brother's place, adopt the child, sell the house, and erase me like a chalk mark on a board. Every time I looked at him, I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask how long he had been planning this, how many of his kisses were lies, how many of his late nights were spent with her. But I kept silent. My silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was strategy. One evening he stood in the kitchen, casually flipping through mail, as if the world hadn't shifted under my feet. I studied him closely. His jawline was tight, his shoulders too relaxed, a man performing calm, when inside he was anything but. "Dinner soon," he asked, his tone smooth. I nodded, my face neutral. On the outside, I played the role he expected, the dutiful wife. On the inside, I was building an arsenal. Every receipt, every invoice, every bank transfer I had ever made into that house I collected. If he wanted a war, he was going to get one. But the part that burned most was Claire. I couldn't shake the image of her, the quiet woman I remembered from the funeral, fragile and grieving. How could she become the person waiting to take my place? Did she know about Linda's manipulations? Did she know Brian was weaving lies not just around me, but around her too? Or was she complicit content to build a life on the ashes of mine? I kept replaying his words in my head. I'll adopt him as soon as the divorce goes through. He'll be my son, our son. There was no hesitation in his voice, no shame. It was a business transaction to him, not a life, not a vow, not a marriage, just strategy. Nights were the worst. I would lie in bed, my body tense, my mind racing, while Brian slept beside me like nothing was wrong. I studied the rhythm of his breathing, the slight twitch in his jaw when he dreamed, and I wondered if he saw visions of Claire in his sleep. Did he picture her in this bed? Did he imagine me gone, already replaced? I wanted to believe I was stronger than this, but the truth was, my heart ached. Grief came in waves, grief for the man I thought I had married. Grief for the home I had poured myself into, grief for the years I had spent building a future with someone who had already chosen another path. But underneath the grief, another feeling grew stronger: defiance. They thought they had cornered me. They thought I was dependent, powerless, finished. But I wasn't. Not yet, and not ever. I began rehearsing scenarios in my head, mapping out conversations, imagining the moment I would finally reveal what I knew. Each plan was sharper, stronger, but I reminded myself that timing was everything. If I moved too soon, he would twist it, spin it, and paint me as paranoid. I needed evidence. I needed proof so solid that even his mother's venom couldn't discredit me. So I stayed quiet. I watched. I smiled when he looked at me. And every time he thought I was folding into the role of the broken wife, I was sharpening my edge. Because he wasn't just cheating. He wasn't just betraying. He was plotting to erase me. And the one mistake he made, the fatal mistake, was underestimating me. This wasn't going to end the way he imagined. Not quietly, not on his terms. It would end on mine. The more I listened, the clearer their strategy became. Brian and Linda weren't content with betrayal. They were designing a demolition plan, one that would crush me legally and financially before tossing me aside. I heard them one afternoon, when Linda visited again, their voices drifting down the hall. If she resists, Linda said, we'll break her down. Women like her always fold. Brian's reply was steady calm, too calm. Then we hit her with the infidelity angle. I nearly stumbled backward. Infidelity. My heart hammered against my ribs. What infidelity? Linda asked. It doesn't matter, he said smoothly. I still have photos from that conference she went to 2 years ago. Just her with colleagues, smiling, a hand on her shoulder. Enough to twist the story, enough to raise doubt. You're a clever boy, Linda purred, just like your father. But Brian wasn't finished. His voice dropped lower, sharper. And if that doesn't stick, we accuse her of leaking client data. She worked with sensitive files. She brought them home all the time. I'll say I caught her trying to sell documents. The company will panic. She'll look guilty enough. I sank against the wall, my hands icy, my chest hollow. My husband, the man who once held my hair back when I was sick, who painted the bedroom walls in the color I chose, was planning to destroy me from the inside out. He would ruin my reputation, sabotage my career, and rob me of the house I had poured my life into, all to clear the path for Claire and her child. I wanted to scream. I wanted to crash into the room and demand answers. But rage wouldn't save me. I had to be smarter than him. That night he slept easily beside me, his breath steady, his face serene, as though the day hadn't included plotting my destruction. I stared at the ceiling, silent tears burning my eyes, and I vowed I would not be erased. The next morning I woke before dawn. I crept into the storage closet, dragging out boxes of receipts, contracts, bank statements, and invoices. I built a pile of proof that screamed my name into the foundation of that house. Every piece of furniture I purchased, every renovation I designed, every bonus I contributed. I photographed it all, packed it into a box, and placed it into my trunk. I drove across town to Emily's apartment, my closest friend, my colleague, the one person who had never betrayed me with gossip or indifference. When she opened the door, her eyes widened at the sight of me, pale and shaking, with a box in my arms. I need a favor, I whispered. She didn't ask questions. She stepped aside, letting me in. In her kitchen, I laid out the documents on the table. If anything happens to me, if I disappear, if I stop answering, take this to my lawyer. Her brow furrowed. Rachel, you're scaring me. I'm not paranoid, I said firmly, but I can't take risks. Emily nodded slowly, her expression tight with concern, but also loyalty. Whatever you need, I've got you. Relief loosened the knot in my chest, but only slightly. I still hadn't told her everything, not about Claire, not about the baby, but she understood enough. She knew I was fighting for my survival. And now I want to ask you, imagine someone you trusted most was plotting to destroy your reputation with lies. Would you confront them, or would you build your defense in silence? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to hear your perspective. As I drove back home, I passed the park where Brian and I used to walk on Sundays. Memories clawed at me, his hand in mine, his laughter in the fading light. That man was gone. The one waiting at home was a stranger. And that stranger believed he could crush me with fabricated scandals and legal tricks. But he underestimated me. He thought I would fold. He thought I would play the role of the broken wife. He was wrong. This war was only beginning. The day after leaving my documents with Emily, I walked into the house with a new sense of purpose. I knew Brian would try to corner me soon to perform his carefully rehearsed role as the sympathetic husband offering me a fresh start. He thought I was blind. He thought I was weak. But I had evidence now. I had an ally. And for the first time in weeks, I wasn't just reacting, I was preparing. That evening, he set the stage exactly as I expected. The living room lights were dimmed. 2 glasses of wine waited on the coffee table. A blanket was draped neatly across the armrest, as though we were about to have some tender conversation, instead of a negotiation about the end of our marriage. He sat in the armchair, lacing his fingers together, sighing theatrically. Rachel, he began, his tone heavy with false sorrow. I've been thinking a lot about us, about where we are. I think we've grown apart. I kept my eyes on the glass of wine, nodding slightly, letting my bottom lip tremble. I gave him the performance he expected. I don't want this to be ugly, he continued. I don't want lawyers or courtrooms. I just think it's time we admit this marriage isn't working anymore. And with you being out of work now, maybe this is the right time for both of us. My stomach turned, but I kept my expression fragile. Are you saying divorce? He nodded solemnly, taking a sip of wine like it was a victory toast. Yes, but amicable, civil. I'm willing to help you get on your feet. You'll need a place to stay, some money to start over. I tilted my head, eyes misty. You'd do that for me. Of course, he said, hand on his chest as if he were a savior. I care about you, Rachel, but we're not right for each other anymore. And the house, it's legally mine. It was left to me by my father. But I want to be fair. I'll offer you a settlement. Enough for a few months of rent. The number he named was laughable, a fraction of what I had invested into that home. But I didn't laugh. I didn't even flinch. I stared at him like I was heartbroken, whispering, I thought we were stronger than this. His hand brushed mine across the table, his expression one of false regret. This is the best path forward, I promise. I nodded slowly, eyes wet, lips pressed tight. Okay, I'll think about it. Relief washed across his face. He thought he had won. He thought I was folding exactly as planned. But behind my silence, I was already sharpening my strategy. He didn't want lawyers, but I was going to bring the best one in town. The next morning, before he even stirred, I slipped out of the house and drove downtown. The old brick building smelled faintly of lavender and ink. Inside, Monica Bell, a woman known for her precision and ruthless intelligence, listened as I laid out my case. I told her about the years of marriage, the shared expenses, the renovations, the receipts and bank statements. I left out Claire and the baby for now, but I gave her enough to see the battlefield ahead. You've been married 12 years, she confirmed, her pen gliding across her pad. Children? No. Proof of contributions to the home. I slid the folder across the desk. Receipts, invoices, bank statements, all of it. She leaned back, folding her hands. Rachel, you have a case, a strong one. But if we go forward, it won't be pretty. He'll fight dirty. I looked her in the eye. He already is. Something flickered in her gaze, respect, maybe recognition. She nodded. Then let's get to work. Walking out of that office, the air felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't drowning. I wasn't cornered. I had someone in my corner, someone who saw the game clearly and knew how to play it better than Brian ever could. As the city bustled around me, I promised myself one thing: he wanted me erased. But I was going to make sure my name, my life, and my truth remained carved into stone. This wasn't surrender. This was the beginning of my counterattack. When I stepped out of Monica's office that morning, the city air hit me like a rebirth. The weight pressing down on my chest loosened. For the first time, I had more than suspicion. I had a plan. Brian thought he had cornered me, but I had just opened another door. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I walked into my office building, shoulders back, head high. My team greeted me with warmth, unaware of the war brewing in my personal life. I smiled, asked about their progress, signed off on new projects, and slid back into my role with ease. Brian thought I was unemployed, broken, vulnerable. The irony almost made me laugh. In reality, I was more powerful than ever. That evening, I came home to find him leaning casually against the kitchen counter, arms folded, trying to look composed. His jaw twitched, though, and his eyes darted like a man struggling to hold the mask in place. "Hey," he said, voice calm, casual. "You got a minute?" I hung my coat on the rack, slowly watching him. "Sure." He gestured toward the living room. Once again, the stage was set, dimmed lights, wine glasses, the same blanket draped like a prop. He thought the first performance had worked. He thought I was still fragile, still malleable. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice rehearsed. "I want to finalize things soon. The divorce, the paperwork, get it all settled so we can move on." I nodded softly. "Okay." His eyes lit up with surprise. "So you agree?" "I'm not fighting the divorce," I said gently, pausing just long enough to make him lean forward. "But I do want to understand what's fair. So, I've spoken with someone." The color drained from his face. His body stiffened. "Someone, a lawyer." I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "Why would you be worried about that? I just want fairness." "You said the house was legally yours, right?" "It is," he snapped quickly. "My father left it to me." "But we've both lived there for over a decade," I replied evenly. "And I've invested money. I have receipts. The kitchen remodel, the bathroom tiles, the new water heater, all from my accounts. I just want acknowledgement." His mask cracked. He stood abruptly, pacing across the rug. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You lived here? That's not the same as owning it." "Then don't insult me," I said softly, my voice calm but sharp. "Don't insult me with a settlement that barely covers 3 months of rent." His eyes burned. For the first time, I saw panic flicker beneath his anger. "You're being unreasonable." "No," I said, standing, slowly meeting his gaze without fear. "I'm being smart. You taught me that, remember? Protect your assets. Plan ahead." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. "You really want to drag lawyers into this? You think that's a good idea?" "I think it's necessary," I answered firmly. "You said you wanted fairness. This is how fairness works." The silence stretched between us, heavy and electric. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't backing down. I wasn't begging. I wasn't bending. I was steady, unshakable, and he knew it. Finally, he muttered, "So what are you going to ask for? Half the house?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't want half. I want what I put in. And maybe a little more for the years you wasted lying to me." His jaw clenched. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. And in that silence, I knew he was afraid. Brian thought he was orchestrating my collapse. He thought I was a pawn in his plan. But now he realized the truth. I was no pawn. I was the opponent, and one he had underestimated for far too long. That night when he retreated to the couch, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. But instead of fear, I felt strength. The battle lines had been drawn, and I was no longer on the defensive. I was ready to fight. The divorce didn't move as quickly as Brian hoped. Once he realized I wasn't playing dead, he dragged his feet. He stalled, delayed, and sent petty emails through his lawyer, someone smug and self-satisfied who clearly believed Brian's story about me being fragile and desperate. But what he hadn't counted on was Monica. My lawyer was sharp, calculated, and relentless. She dissected every claim his team made and countered with receipts, bank transfers, and renovation invoices that bore my name. Each time Brian's lawyer tried to undermine me, Monica laid another piece of evidence on the table, like a dagger. Slowly, the battlefield tilted in my favor. Brian grew restless. At one hearing, I caught him glaring at me across the table, his eyes filled with frustration, and something else, fear. He didn't expect resistance. He didn't expect me to walk into the room with my head high, shoulders squared, and a quiet confidence he could no longer shatter. At home, the mask slipped even further. He stomped through rooms, slammed cabinets, muttered under his breath. Once he cornered me in the hallway. "Do you really want to do this?" he hissed. "You think you can win?" I met his stare without blinking. I don't think. I know. That night he slept on the couch again, and I lay in bed realizing something monumental. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear that had once kept me paralyzed had burned away, replaced by something unshakable. He could try to smear me, he could throw accusations, but I had built my defense too carefully. He was the one unraveling now. Still, there was a shadow I hadn't spoken aloud in court, yet Claire and the baby. That secret remained tucked inside me like dynamite, waiting for the right spark. I hadn't told Monica. I hadn't told Emily. I kept it close, biding my time. Brian believed his betrayal was invisible, but he didn't know I was already watching every move. One morning I stood by the window sipping coffee, watching him load his truck for work. He moved slower, his jaw tight, his shoulders hunched. I wondered if Claire knew how much of his life was cracking apart. I wondered if Linda whispered in his ear at night, telling him I would eventually fold. They were wrong. I was still here, stronger than ever. And before I go further, let me leave you with this thought. Sometimes in life, we reach a point where fear turns into fire. When betrayal pushes us past the breaking point, we stop being victims and start being warriors. Have you ever felt that shift in your own life? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to know how you found your strength. The weeks passed and the hearings continued. Each time Brian tried to assert his control, Monica dismantled his arguments piece by piece. When his lawyer argued that the house was his alone, Monica slid forward proof of my financial contributions. When they tried to minimize my involvement, she presented photographs, delivery receipts, and bank statements with my signature. I watched Brian's confidence erode. The man who once told me I was nothing now couldn't meet my eyes. His silence in those moments was worth more than any settlement. It was proof that the power dynamic had shifted. And through it all, I kept my secret close. I knew the time would come when Claire's name and the baby she carried would surface. I knew it would be the twist Brian never saw coming. But until then, I held it tight, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate the truth. Because revenge is not about shouting first. It's about knowing when to strike last. Courtrooms have a way of stripping people bare. The fluorescent lights, the sterile walls, the quiet shuffle of papers, there's no place to hide. For Brian, it became the stage where his carefully crafted lies began to unravel. For me, it was the battlefield where my silence transformed into strength. Monica guided me with precision. She built our case like a fortress brick by brick, each piece of evidence another weapon. When Brian's lawyer claimed the house was his alone, Monica presented receipts with my name. Invoices for renovations I had designed, bank statements, showing transfers from my accounts. The judge listened, scribbling notes, while Brian's jaw tightened, his eyes darting between us. He tried to retaliate with venom. They brought up the photos from my conference 2 years ago, me smiling with colleagues, a hand resting briefly on my shoulder. They twisted it into something it wasn't. Potential signs of infidelity, his lawyer suggested smugly. But Monica leaned forward, her tone crisp. "These are professional images," she countered. "There's no evidence of misconduct. My client's record is spotless. This is an insult to both her integrity and this court's time." The judge nodded. Brian's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Strike one. Next, they tried to paint me as careless with client documents. They hinted that I had taken sensitive files home, that I might have mishandled them. My stomach twisted. This was the lie I had overheard Brian planning. But Monica was ready. She presented company policies, testimony from my manager, and spotless audits of my work. Not only is there no evidence, she said, there is overwhelming proof of professionalism. The accusation collapsed under its own weight. Strike two. Each time they tried to smear me, Monica turned it back on them. And with every failed attempt, Brian's mask cracked a little more. I could see the sweat along his hairline, the way his hands clenched under the table, the flicker of panic in his eyes. Meanwhile, I sat steady, composed. I wasn't the trembling wife he expected. I was the woman who had walked into the fire and come out steel. At one recess, he cornered me in the hallway. His voice dropped to a hiss. "You're going to regret this." I met his eyes calmly. "I already regret marrying you. Everything else is just correction." His jaw locked. He turned away, fists clenched at his sides. That was the moment I knew I had already won. The hearings dragged on for weeks, but the momentum stayed with us. Monica was relentless, and I was unshakable. Brian, on the other hand, grew desperate. His lawyer stumbled through arguments that fell flat. Linda glared from the back row, her disapproval sharp enough to cut glass. And through it all, I never let them see me falter, because this was bigger than a house, bigger than money. It was about reclaiming my voice, my worth, my freedom. And let me leave you with this before we continue. When someone underestimates you, they hand you the most powerful weapon you can carry. Have you ever turned someone's doubt into your strength? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear how you rose when no one expected it. When the session closed that day, I walked out of the courthouse into the cool evening air. I could still feel Brian's glare burning into my back, but it no longer mattered. The balance had shifted, the lies were crumbling, and soon the life he had tried to erase me from would collapse on top of him instead. The final blow came not in a courtroom, but in a sterile conference room downtown. A long oak table stretched between us, papers stacked neatly, pens poised. The air smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Brian sat across from me, his lawyer at his side, Linda lurking in the corner like a shadow that refused to fade. For weeks they had fought. For weeks they had thrown accusations, twisted truths, and tried to smear my name. But now the walls were closing in on them. Monica laid out the settlement like a final verdict. Every receipt, every invoice, every contribution I had made to that house. It was undeniable. Brian's lawyer tried to argue, but even he sounded weary. The judge had already seen enough, the evidence too heavy to dismiss. In the end, there was no escaping it. I would receive a fair settlement. My financial contributions would be recognized. And most importantly, I would walk away with my dignity intact. Brian didn't look at me, not once. His eyes stayed fixed on the papers in front of him, his hand moving only to scrawl his signature. The man who once held all the power now looked small, diminished like a boy caught in his own lies. Linda shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressed tight, her dream of erasing me slipping through her fingers. When it was my turn, I signed each document carefully, my hand steady, my heart strong. This wasn't just ink on paper, it was closure. It was the severing of chains that had bound me to a man who never valued me, to a family that wanted me gone. As the final signature dried, I gathered my things and stood. For a moment, I looked at Brian. He still refused to meet my eyes, but I didn't need him to. I could see it in his face anyway, regret, disbelief, maybe even fear. The story he had written for me had ended differently than he planned. I tucked the pen into my bag and said softly, "You always underestimated me." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. He didn't reply. He couldn't. Walking out of that building, I felt the air shift. It was lighter, freer, as if the world itself was acknowledging my survival. I didn't win everything. I didn't want everything. I wanted fairness, recognition, and the right to walk away with my head held high. And I got it. Brian, on the other hand, was left with the life he thought he wanted, a house built on lies, a relationship forged from betrayal, a family stitched together with manipulation. But lies don't make strong foundations, and though I didn't stay to watch it crumble, I knew it would. That night, I moved into my new apartment. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. The view overlooked the river, the water glistening under the city lights. I unpacked, slowly placing each item where I wanted it, savoring the peace in every choice. No one told me I was being dramatic. No one dismissed my opinions. For the first time in years, every decision was mine. I kept the lights on that first night, not out of fear, but because I could. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was healing. Brian thought he had replaced me. He thought he had erased me. But what he never understood was this: when you underestimate someone, you give them the very strength to rise higher than you ever imagined. And I had risen. Life after the divorce was nothing like Brian imagined. He thought I would vanish quietly humiliated and broken, leaving him free to build his new fantasy with Claire and Linda cheering on the sidelines. But I didn't vanish. I rebuilt, slowly, steadily, on my terms. My apartment was small, but it overlooked the river. The first night I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea watching the lights shimmer on the water. The silence around me was not the suffocating kind I had endured in that house. This silence was mine. It was peaceful. It was earned. Word traveled quickly through friends and whispers. Claire had moved into Brian's house just as planned. But things weren't as idyllic as they imagined. Raising a child wasn't simple. The late nights, the financial strain, the constant tension, it all began to show. Linda tried to micromanage, of course hovering like a hawk, but even she couldn't patch the cracks in their picture-perfect facade. I didn't linger on their struggles. I didn't check their social media or hunt for gossip. Still stories found me. Emily mentioned once over coffee that Claire looked exhausted, that Brian's temper was fraying, that Linda's meddling had created more chaos than control. None of it surprised me. Because a life built on deception will always collapse under its own weight. Meanwhile, my life was steady. My career flourished after the promotion. My name carried respect in the office. I found comfort in routines. Saturday boxing classes, long evening walks, phone calls with my sister. I picked up poetry again, words that reminded me I was still capable of beauty, even after so much ugliness. At times, loneliness crept in, but I learned that solitude isn't the same as being alone. Sometimes solitude is healing. It's space to breathe, to reclaim the pieces of yourself that were buried under years of shrinking for someone else's ego. One evening, as I boxed up old papers I no longer needed, I found the folder Monica had helped me build, the evidence that saved me. I traced my fingers over the receipts, the invoices, the statements. Proof not only of my financial contributions, but of something deeper, my worth. The reminder that I was never powerless, even when they tried to convince me I was. I realized then that Brian's greatest mistake wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the underestimation. He thought I would crumble. He thought I would fold under pressure, surrender, quietly disappear into the shadows. But betrayal has a way of igniting something fierce. And once it ignites, nothing can put it out. Before I close this chapter, let me ask, have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they could control you? Did it make you smaller, or did it make you stronger? Share your story in the comments, because I know I'm not alone in this fight. And if you want to hear more stories of survival and rising stronger, make sure to subscribe and stay with me for the next one. I leaned back on my couch that night, the city humming outside my window, and I smiled to myself. I wasn't the same woman who once cried in silence while her husband plotted against her. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone unshakable, someone who had fought for her freedom and won. Brian wanted me erased, but instead I wrote a new story, one where I didn't just survive, I thrived. The first morning in my new apartment, I woke to the sound of birds outside the window and the golden light of sunrise spilling across the walls. For a moment, I simply lay there, listening to the quiet. It wasn't the heavy silence of my old home filled with secrets and resentment. This was different. This was peace. I brewed coffee in a small kitchen that smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. I stood barefoot on the cool floor, sipping slowly, watching the river sparkle beyond the glass. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing on my chest, no fear of hidden conversations or stage performances. The air was mine, the space was mine, the life ahead was mine. I didn't think of Brian much anymore. When I did, it wasn't with bitterness, but with clarity. His story would continue, messy, fractured, built on lies. But it was no longer my story. Mine was about freedom, resilience, and the simple beauty of starting over. I filled my days with things that nourished me. Books that reminded me of forgotten dreams. Boxing classes that made me strong in both body and spirit. Walks through the park where I once mourned, now breathing in the possibility of tomorrow. I called my sister more often, laughed with Emily over late-night pizza, and even wrote poetry again, lines about strength, about reclaiming space, about the quiet joy of being underestimated, and then rising higher than anyone expected. One evening I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, the city twinkling outside. I smiled, realizing I wasn't afraid of shadows anymore. They no longer held secrets meant to destroy me. They were simply reminders of what I had overcome. Being underestimated had become my greatest gift. Because when I finally rose, no one, not Brian, not Linda, not anyone saw it coming. And that was my freedom.